What's going on, people? Welcome to United View and welcome to a special edition of the Tactical View. Manchester United have just confirmed the signing of Mason Mount, and so in this video we'll be taking a closer look at what Mason Mount can bring to Erik ten Hag's Manchester United and how he takes us closer to Manchester City and Arsenal. Now, the first thing to say is that a lot has been made recently of Mason Mount maybe not being the best or exceptional at any particular attribute, but that isn't necessarily a bad thing because this is not a Pep Guardiola team or a Xavi team or any of those positional play coaches. Erik ten Hag is in fact very different to all of them. Now, what I mean by that is if we look across to the tactical pad here, if you're talking about a Guardiola team, what you tend to see is that throughout the phases of the game, every single player in that 11 has a specific role or a specific job, and there isn't too much variation at different moments in terms of what they do. So, for example, what we've seen to great effect this season is John Stones stepping into midfield to create that extra man, and what you end up with is what's left of a sort of 3-2-2-3 system. So you end up with a back three, in this case built of Dalot, Martinez and Luke Shaw. Then you've got the two in front of Casemiro and Varane, and in front of that you've got sort of Mason Mount and Fernandes in the positions that you'd have maybe De Bruyne and Gundogan, and then obviously the front three in front with the wingers holding the width and the striker through the middle. Now, in a Pep Guardiola team, what you tend to see is that each of these 11 players will have their own specific zones or areas of the pitch and their own specific jobs that they have to do throughout the 90 minutes. So, for example, if the left winger was in possession of the ball here, where Jadon Sancho is here, what you'd see from the 8 on the right side, maybe Kevin De Bruyne, is that he wouldn't come across too far and try to get involved in the play over here. He would be tasked with staying out in the half space there on the opposite side, waiting for that ball to come across to ensure that City then had the overload on the opposite side. So what these positional play coaches do, sort of Guardiola, Xavi, that sort of mould of coach, is they their main principle is by circulating the ball, you find the gaps in the opposition. Whereas Erik ten Hag prefers to use more fluidity and more rotation. So, for example, with ten Hag, what you might see is that, yes, he might look to create that same shape of that 3-2-2-3 at different moments, but that's very situational depending on how the opposition press. So, for example, if the opposition were pressing with a front two, then yes, maybe we'd look to build with that back three, Martinez, Varane and Dalot. And maybe we'd have Luke Shaw tucking in here to help out Casemiro. And in this situation, one possible way that United's front five could configure themselves is with the wingers staying really wide, holding the width. Then you'd have Mount and Bruno in these sort of inside channels. And that's one possible sort of option for those attacking midfield players. But in different moments of the game, United's players might line up in a different sort of configuration. So you might see, for example, yes, staying with that back three, but in this particular moment, actually, maybe Jadon Sancho has identified that there's some sort of good opportunity to come inside and operate in these areas where he's better in those sort of narrower areas linking up with other players. And so what you might see is Luke Shaw maybe pushing on a little bit wider, and that means that Mason Mount might be the one that tucks into midfield, into the pivot here. So what you can see straight away is that compared to a Manchester City or a Barcelona, where the players have defined roles and defined positions to be on the pitch at different moments, which requires obviously a player with a very specific skill set for that particular role, so they need to be very good at one or two specific things. Actually, under Erik ten Hag, a Manchester United player needs to be capable of doing 3 or 4 different roles very well, and that is where Mason Mount comes in. Yes, he may not be as exceptional as Kevin De Bruyne in a particular job, but what he can do, Mason Mount, is that yes, he can come in here and sort of operate in the pivot and receive the ball off the defenders, look to play forward, look to carry that ball forward, look to pass the ball forward with progressive passing. But he can also operate in wider areas. Maybe if Luke Shaw was tucking into the pivot in a particular moment, Mason Mount can pop up on the wings. And also if in a particular moment as the game unfolds, if Jadon Sancho was really wide or Marcus Rashford was wide, Mason Mount can operate in these inside channel areas as well. So what it is about Mason Mount that Erik ten Hag really likes in terms of his in-possession quality, it's his versatility, it's his flexibility. So although we see all over the place at the moment this new trend of wanting to display teams in this sort of 3-2-2-3 formation as we see it, in game, that's often not how things pan out for Erik ten Hag teams. So in certain moments, sure, you might see a double pivot. In other moments of the game, it might be that Luke Shaw's pushed up high as well. Sancho's gone a bit narrower. Mason Mount's still much higher than Casemiro. So sometimes it becomes a 3-1-6. And what it is with ten Hag compared to those other coaches is that it's a lot less rigid, a lot less sort of stable in terms of the formation. There's a lot more fluidity, a lot more room for interpretation. But what that requires from the players is players that can operate in different zones, but also have the intelligence to combine based on where the other players are. And I think that's something that Mason Mount has always been fantastic at. And if you listen to some of the things that his previous managers have said about him, one thing that always gets praised with Mason Mount is his tactical awareness and his ability to work out where other players are moving to, where they've come from, and where they're going to be in the next action. So, for example, Mason Mount I'm sure Mason Mount will link up brilliantly with Luke Shaw, and particularly Jadon Sancho if Sancho ends up playing more on the left next season, or if sort of Mason Mount and Sancho both play on the right. I think that understanding that Mason Mount's able to have with different players could be absolutely fantastic and a really helpful asset for United. And one of the reasons why Erik ten Hag's sort of philosophy relies a lot more on this fluidity is because obviously Pep Guardiola has massively revolutionised the English game, but because his formation and his sort of way he sets his teams up can be quite rigid, one of the ways that teams have adapted to play against this and sort of counter this is by a lot of man marking, because you know that in a Guardiola team, you're always going to have the winger in these really wide zones. You're always going to have the 8 in the half spaces in these sorts of zones. So what you can do, one way of possibly defending against this is sort of assigning each player one of those attacking players to mark. So, for example, number 6 here can mark Mason Mount, the fullback can go and mark Jadon Sancho, and the opposition winger can maybe deal with Luke Shaw. So that man-to-man orientation works really well against a rigid team, but Erik ten Hag's teams are one step ahead of that. And because and his way of breaking that down is lots of fluidity, lots of rotations, meaning that if teams do decide to go man-to-man and mark, what you end up with in that situation is that United players, maybe Luke Shaw will say, right, you're man marking me, you're following me everywhere I go, right, I'm going to go stand here, drag you somewhere you don't want to be, and that will create space for maybe Jadon Sancho to drop in or Mason Mount to drop in. But that relies on players that are able to fluidly combine and be really intelligent in different situations to work out what the demands of the game are at that specific moment. So there's a lot more emphasis and responsibility given to the players in Erik ten Hag's philosophy than you get in Pep Guardiola's philosophy, where in the Guardiola system there's a lot of emphasis on ball retention and sort of making the right decision for the most net positive in that particular moment, whereas Ten Hag trusts his players to see and identify and adapt to the situation that's unfolding at that precise moment. So he trusts them to move around a lot more, occupy different zones and do different things. So that's where the versatility of Mason Mount is a massive upgrade on what Manchester United have got, and that's why Ten Hag wanted him to add as his first signing of this summer. Now, what he's got that Christian Eriksen doesn't have, obviously Eriksen's got that fantastic quality in possession, particularly when he drops into this sort of false fullback position to pick up the ball on the left side that we've seen quite a lot this season when Luke Shaw tucks in, for example, or goes really high. What Mason Mount's got is, because he's a lot quicker, he's got that athleticism, and I think also with his youth, he makes his decisions a lot faster. He can occupy different zones, but also he can dovetail and interchange much more quickly in those positions than possibly Christian Eriksen could. So I think that is a massive upgrade for United in possession in terms of Mason Mount's athleticism. Now, obviously, I think one thing that's been made a lot of, and rightly so, is that Eriksen defensively has been pretty much a training cone for a large part of the season, particularly since he returned from injury. And under Ten Hag's management, United do tend to go man for man in midfield. So if you end up with a player that isn't able to keep up with the running that their opposite number's doing, you're going to end up with a situation where you're getting overrun in midfield. And with Christian Eriksen in midfield, that was an issue that was frequently being exploited for opposing teams against United. So with Mason Mount, that's something that we shouldn't see anywhere near as much of. Mount is much more tenacious, he's much better in the duel, and of course, if he does get beaten, he's got much more energy in his legs to keep going and chase after and catch up. I think, expanding on that, one of the issues that United have had at different points during the season is when the opposition are playing out from the back, particularly at goal kicks, because as we said, Ten Hag likes to go for a lot of man-to-man orientation over the pitch. So we'll see defensively, United's fullbacks will be quite high on the opposition wingers. We'll have one of our centre-backs high on the opposition striker with the other one deeper to sweep. We'll then be man-to-man in midfield, as we've said, and then what our wingers will do, the starting positions that they will occupy, is a sort of half and half role between the centre-backs and the full-backs that the opposition will push up often nice and high. And what that means is that quite often the United wingers will end up jumping onto the opposition centre-backs, leaving the full-back free. Now, if that's happened on the left side, typically this season, where maybe Jadon Sancho or Marcus Rashford jumped onto the centre-back, the ball's gone back to the keeper, and look, as most keepers in the Premier League have the ability to do, unlike somebody that we've just released, they can find that fullback with a clipped pass, and then there's a problem for United. Is this a situation where Luke Shaw should go and commit and get down the line, in which case the winger's free because Martinez has been dragged across by the striker, so that's potentially not a good idea. Is our winger able to even get back in and maybe deal with the fullback there? Sometimes that can't always happen, but what is often a good solution to that is the midfielder shuttling across really quickly to shut down the space. Now, Eriksen obviously hasn't got the gas in his legs to be able to do that, hasn't got the energy left in his tank. Mason Mount will be able to do that all day long because of his supreme athleticism. So that for me is another area where, as well as the in-possession stuff, Mason Mount will also be a massive upgrade for United out of possession in terms of our defensive setup. So pretty much there in all phases of the game, Mason Mount is a huge upgrade on Christian Eriksen, and that is why Ten Hag was so desperate to get him involved in the team. Now, with a lot of these videos about new signings, we do tend to get carried away a little bit with some of the positives of their game, and we sometimes don't want to talk about their weaknesses. So that's the last thing I want to mention in this video, is one of Mason Mount's biggest weaknesses is one of those particular areas that he might be asked to operate in. So we talked about how when United have the ball in advanced areas, Mason Mount, because of Ten Hag's sort of system and the way he likes a lot of rotation and fluidity, he'll be asked to do a lot of different jobs. But one of those jobs is undoubtedly going to be when the winger's wide, when Luke Shaw's maybe tucked into midfield or is offering sort of a traditional fullback role a little bit wider, what we might see is Mason Mount asked to operate between the lines in a more traditional attacking midfielder position. Now, where maybe Bruno Fernandes is quite good and a lot of other world-class elite attacking midfielders are very good, is that they're able to sort of receive the ball in these positions without losing it, despite the fact that you're going to have, by definition almost, pressure coming from multiple angles and multiple different areas. So obviously when you're between the lines, if you get a ball from Lisandro Martinez here that sort of splits the defenders, finds Mason Mount in this pocket here, he's going to immediately attract, at the very least, the defensive midfielder and one of the back four, whether that's the centre-backs or the full-backs. Now, Mason Mount technically is very good at shielding the ball from one possible opponent. So you often see Mount pop up in the wider areas where he's only ever going to have to deal with one opponent. So if Sancho's tucked in, Mount receives the ball here. Doesn't really matter what sort of body position he's receiving in. If it's only the fullback pressing, Mount is more than capable of scanning, working out where that fullback is, and retaining the ball with his body position, getting his body between the defender and the ball. Where Mount can struggle, though, is when he's receiving the ball in inside areas, and that means you get a secondary defender or maybe even a tertiary defender, a third defender coming into play, and that means that Mount's got to be a little bit more aware of where they're coming in from. So in this sequence here, what you can see is that as Mount receives the ball, he's very aware straight away of where the centre-back is. And then moving on to the second image, you can see that because of that, he's positioned himself well between the centre-back and the ball, but he's got no idea of where James Ward-Prowse is coming in from, the midfielder sort of on the opposite side, on Mason Mount's blind side. Now, sort of a world-class elite attacking midfielder's got that awareness, that ability to see that in their peripheral vision, but Mount doesn't in this situation, and therefore, with his next touch, he ends up turning into where that pressure's coming from and ends up losing the ball quite quickly. So, I think if there is a weakness for Mason Mount, and that's a little bit too optimistic. There is a weakness for Mason Mount here, but if he's able to improve upon that, he's able to go up another level in his game and mean that he's effective inside the opposition block just as much as he is outside it, because he's very good at dropping deep to receive the ball. He's pretty comfortable at carrying the ball forward, sort of progressive passing through the opposition block. I wouldn't say he's a world beater at it, but he's very good at it. Very good in the wide areas. We've seen from him playing on the wing a lot of times for Chelsea and sometimes for England as well. And if he can go up that level in terms of receiving the ball between the lines, he will be one of the best attacking midfielders around. Whether he can or not remains to be seen. That's a job for Erik ten Hag and his coaching staff. But fingers crossed he can, so that he can become one of Manchester United's great players. I'm really excited to see Mason Mount take to the grass and see what he can do in pre-season. Hopefully you are too, and hopefully you've enjoyed this video. We'll be back again very soon with another tactical breakdown, hopefully of a new goalkeeper for United. And until then, see you guys again very soon. Peace.